Angel Reese has officially been traded to the Atlanta Dream, and what should have been a clean, fresh start is already turning into one of the most uncomfortable arrivals we've seen in recent WNBA memory. Before she even played a single game, her new teammates didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. In fact, some of the comments at her introductory press conference were so blunt that the room reportedly went quiet. Not the usual awkward silence you hear when media questions stall, but the kind where everyone realizes something just got said that can't be walked back. And here's the part that really stands out. These weren't random critics online or rival fans talking from a distance. These were her own teammates, the same players she's supposed to share a locker room with, run plays with, and potentially chase a title alongside. That's what makes this situation feel so tense already. The energy around Atlanta didn't just shift, it cracked open in public view before the season even began. But to understand why things are already this messy in Atlanta, you have to go back to Chicago, where Angel Reese's time with the Sky ended in a way that raised more questions than answers. On paper, her impact looks strong. She entered the league with huge attention, delivered elite rebounding numbers, and became a consistent double-double machine almost immediately. The highlights were everywhere, and her name stayed in constant circulation throughout her rookie season. But basketball isn't played on highlight clips, and the Chicago Sky's record told a very different story. The wins didn't follow the hype. Instead, the team struggled to build momentum and finished far from playoff contention. Over 2 seasons, the Sky's overall record sank into a pattern that didn't reflect progress. One year showed flashes of potential, but the next year, the results actually dipped even further. That's not the direction any franchise wants when they're building around a young star. And this is where the conversation starts to get complicated, because while Reese's rebounding numbers looked dominant, critics pointed out that a significant portion of those boards came off her own missed shots. That detail doesn't erase her effort or talent, but it does change how people interpret the impact behind the stats. Numbers can tell a story, but they don't always tell the full one. Inside the organization, things reportedly weren't smooth either. Multiple insider reports suggested tension between Reese and parts of the locker room, with teammates and staff feeling like the environment became increasingly difficult over time. That kind of dynamic rarely stays contained, especially when a team is losing. And in Chicago's case, the losses kept stacking up. By the time the Sky decided to move on, the situation wasn't framed as a typical basketball decision anymore. It felt like something had reached a breaking point. The trade itself, even for a high-profile player, didn't bring back the kind of return you'd expect for a 2-time All-Star, but the way it was accepted suggested Chicago wasn't chasing value as much as they were trying to reset the atmosphere entirely. Then came Atlanta. The Dream didn't just add Reese into an empty role. They brought her into a roster already featuring established names like Ryan Howard, Alicia Gray, and a supporting core built around playoff expectations. On paper, this looked like a team trying to push into contention, but chemistry in basketball is never just about names on a roster sheet. And that's where things immediately got interesting. At the introductory press conference, when players were asked about Reese, the responses didn't follow the usual polite script. Ryan Howard made a comment about past matchups that came off less like praise and more like confidence in her own success against Chicago's defense. Alicia Gray went even further, openly admitting she enjoyed those games because she played her best basketball in those matchups. Then came Nalissa Smith, who didn't soften anything at all, directly calling Reese annoying in a moment that instantly spread across social media. It wasn't just what was said, it was the tone. There was no hesitation, no careful wording, no effort to protect first impressions. And for a player arriving in a new environment, that kind of public honesty from teammates before tip-off is rare. So now Atlanta finds itself in a situation where expectations and reality are already colliding. The Dream are trying to build a contender, but the conversation around them has shifted toward whether the locker room dynamic can actually support that goal. Because talent alone doesn't guarantee cohesion, and cohesion is what separates good teams from frustrated ones. Meanwhile, Reese's time in Chicago continues to be dissected. Some analysts argue the fit never truly worked, pointing to spacing issues and roster construction that didn't maximize anyone's strengths. Others believe the responsibility is more shared, that the system around her never fully evolved to match modern WNBA spacing demands. One of the biggest tactical concerns that followed her into Atlanta is still the same: floor spacing. In today's WNBA, front courts that can stretch the floor are becoming essential. When bigs can shoot from outside, defenses are forced to stretch, creating driving lanes and opening the paint. Without that, defenses collapse inward and clog every action before it develops. That's exactly what happened repeatedly in Chicago. Opposing teams packed the paint, forcing difficult shots and limiting clean offensive flow. And in Atlanta, the early concern is whether the roster construction is truly different enough to avoid repeating that same issue. Because if defenses can still sit inside and wait, then even elite guards like Rhyne Howard and Alicia Gray are forced into tougher looks. And no matter how talented a backcourt is, efficiency drops when spacing disappears. This is where the pressure point becomes obvious. Reese's rebounding ability is not in question. Her energy and physical presence are also real assets. But the question teams keep circling back to is whether her overall offensive profile stretches defenses or allows them to tighten their coverage. And in the modern game, that difference changes everything. What makes the Atlanta situation even more interesting is that expectations are already high. This isn't a rebuilding team anymore. This is a roster that believes it can compete. But championship-level teams don't just rely on talent. They rely on clarity in roles, trust in the system, and chemistry that holds under pressure. Right now, none of that has been tested yet. All we've seen is introductions, early comments, and reactions that already feel unusually sharp for a player who hasn't logged a minute in a Dream uniform. At the same time, Chicago has moved aggressively in a new direction. The roster reshuffle, the addition of experienced guards, and the shift in leadership all suggest a franchise trying to redefine itself quickly. And interestingly, some of those moves happened almost immediately after the trade, signaling just how fast they wanted to turn the page. That contrast is impossible to ignore. One organization appears to be resetting entirely. The other is stepping into a spotlight with expectations, but already carrying early friction before the season begins. And in the middle of all this is Angel Reese, a player whose impact on the court is still undeniable, but whose fit in team environments is now being discussed just as much as her production. As the season approaches, the real question isn't about highlights or rebounding totals. It's about whether Atlanta can turn early tension into chemistry before it becomes a pattern. Because once that narrative sets in, it becomes very hard to reverse. For now, everything remains speculation and anticipation. But one thing is already clear. This is not a quiet arrival, and Atlanta is no longer just building a roster. They're managing expectations, personalities, and pressure all at once. And in a league where margins are thin and chemistry matters as much as talent, that might end up being the real story to watch.